On today's World Insight, light at the end of the tunnel in the race for a COVID-19 vaccine. How soon and how potent are the candidates? And American culture dominates the global pop scene, while Chinese culture is more challenging to master. Is the difference fueling misunderstanding?
With the goodwill that I see in China and also in the U.S., that I think that a lot of people will go back to the cooperative kind of atmosphere that we had before. I'm not saying it's not serious, but I think that it's not a permanent.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Researchers around the world are racing to develop a vaccine against COVID-19, with more than 170 candidate vaccines now tracked by the World Health Organization. Among those, the promising ones are reportedly from the UK, the U.S., China, and some are also suggesting Russia, with large-scale human tests underway in different parts of the world. However, coronaviruses are a large family of viruses, and there were previously no vaccines for any of them. With the virus still mutating rapidly, will there be ever an effective vaccine, and how much longer do we have to wait? After it comes into being, will people trust it? A discussion with our panelists from different parts of the world. For more on that in Seoul, we are joined by Jeremy Kim, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Mr. Kim, what a pleasure to see you once again.
It's a pleasure to see you also.
Busy time. So, 6, according to the WHO, coming into trial 3, third stage of the vaccine. However, there are others that keep on popping up. Tell me more about your assessment. What is the real picture?
So it's very important that we have 6 vaccines entering phase 3 testing. Phase 3, of course, is the stage where we show that a vaccine is both safe and effective. And that's critical. We hope that in the next 4 months or so, we'll get a signal, an early signal from one of these vaccines that shows that it's actually protecting people against COVID-19 infection. And that will be a very, very important step. But equally important will be being able to manufacture it and then being able to distribute it around the world and to use it to prevent infections wherever they're occurring.
There are several things you mentioned. First of all, early sign of victory. Tell me exactly, what would you consider as the early sign of victory?
So I think that the World Health Organization, the Chinese government, the U.S. government have all picked a similar standard, which is 50% protection against infection. Now, we don't actually know that any of the candidates that are currently in clinical testing will do that, although the data that they've shown so far in terms of protecting monkeys against infection have suggested that many, not only the candidates currently in phase 3, but others as well, may protect humans against infection. But we've been using the 50% cutoff is very important. Importantly, though, it's not just 50%. You can't just do it in 10 people and have 5 protected and 5 not. These are trials that have to be conducted in tens of thousands of people in order for governments, like the Chinese government or the World Health Organization, to be comfortable that the vaccine actually does what we say that it does, that the 50% protection is a robust number and is not going to be influenced by not having enough people in the clinical trial.
Then we come to another issue, which is about manufacturing. We have seen earlier discussion, you and I have been talking about this, there has to be a strategy and people need to agree upon it and implement it when it is the time. How can we understand what is the real picture now in terms of manufacturing?
So it's identified that in the world there is maybe the capacity to manufacture 10 billion doses a year. Now, all of that isn't going to be for COVID-19 because there are other very important vaccines that will need to continue to be made. CEPI has set as a target 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, and has also identified enough glass vials to put all that vaccine into, which is actually really critical when you think about how we get vaccines transported around the world. Other companies are saying that they can make hundreds of millions of doses, but again, these are discussions, and sometimes these are deals that have just been formalized. And it's really going to be important to see that technology from one company can be effectively transferred to another company, and that second company can actually manufacture the vaccines at a quality sufficient to be able to be used around the world. We have to work together to do this. The thing that concerns me the most is that we aren't coordinated. It needs to go into ensuring that when we have the vaccine, that it isn't going to be a single deal between China and Brazil, or a single deal between a U.S. or European-based company and a country somewhere in the world. This has to be a solution that will be available to people all over the world, big countries and small countries, rich countries and poor countries.
We have already seen some bad examples. For example, the U.S. storage of remdesivir, 80% of the global production. From a scientist's perspective, how to really avoid it when you see the reality is that the world is crippled by geopolitics? Is there some, plan B that we can think about?
I think that plan B is really to go to international organizations and use the power of countries working together. I mean, the Chinese government, European governments, other countries around the world can form a very forceful and formidable bloc to advocate strongly for fairness in the distribution of drugs and medicines for global health.
There are some new candidates on the scene that are not necessarily recognized by the WHO. For example, the Sputnik 5, the recent Russia's announcement of a fast-track vaccine, their own version, that has stirred quite a debate. Right after it, interestingly, you see U.S. President Donald Trump trying to order doses of vaccines that are not necessarily coming out of a trial 3 yet. How to fast-track the vaccine research and tests so that it will be on time to save life for COVID-19, which is already spreading around the world widely.
So that is a complicated question.
Yes.
The United States is manufacturing vaccine so that when and if the vaccine is shown to be effective, it can be approved and licensed the correct way, but that they also then have the vaccine available when it's shown to be safe and effective. The problem with jumping the gun, with, for instance, claiming that you have a vaccine that's approved when in fact it hasn't been shown to be safe and effective, is dangerous. Because if that vaccine is used and people believe that they're protected and then increase their risk they engage in more risky behavior, then that's actually a bad thing. Also, if we don't know that the vaccine is safe and people are using a vaccine because the government has approved it, then again we set the government up and the companies up for a bit of a significant problem, because then people will be hurt because of potentially a false claim. So I think that the best thing to do is to wait until we actually have the data. Show the scientists the data, show the regulatory agencies the data, prove that the vaccine is safe and effective before you claim that it is and before you issue a license. I think that governments around the world are committed to the same standard of efficacy. The World Health Organization actually has an international standard as well, which it uses to license vaccines that are going to be used in global health, and that's called pre-qualification. So companies, actually Chinese companies or Indian companies or American and European companies that want to have vaccine purchased for global health, for the Global Alliance for Vaccines for Gavi, have to meet the pre-qualification standard.
There's the issue of trust here. That is crucial. However, there's also an issue of science literacy. We have seen, after the Sputnik 5 coming out, there's a lot of debate about trust. But before that, the debate already happened. In the United States, for example, a huge number of those being polled in various public polls have been suggesting they do not want to have vaccine. So that's only one of those examples in the world. So Dr. Kim, it's not about, it seems, whether the scientists are running around the clock, against the clock. It's not about many of the manufacturers are running around against the clock. It's not even whether the distributors are running against the clock. It's whether, to a certain extent, in some countries, whether people are going to accept a science-related product, which is called vaccine.
In fact, the surveys are suggesting that a significant number of Americans or Europeans, for that matter, might not take the vaccine. The problem is that we really don't know. The scientists don't have, the politicians, the public health figures don't have the ability to say, here's the vaccine. I have it in my hand. We've shown that it's safe and effective. Things may change once we have that. So we have to wait for the data. And unfortunately, while we've been waiting to do things the right way, to develop the science, to develop the confidence in a vaccine, other people have been trying to undermine that confidence. And you know, the way the news cycle and the publicity cycle and social media works, unfortunately, you know, we don't have right now the proof that the vaccine works. And when we do, we will have a powerful weapon.
Right.
And we also have, I think, the same trust that people have that vaccines are safe and effective. And hopefully that is something that we can stand by.
Finally, before we go, we've seen only one country. I'm not just saying because we are broadcasting from Beijing in China, but only we are seeing one country, China, has claimed that once a successful vaccine comes out that are proved to be effective, it's going to be a global public good. When are we going to see, Dr. Tim, the other countries, the other manufacturers, researchers, teams going to come out and suggest that they're going to do the same? Only after the pledge they will implement. Without the pledge, it is far from becoming a reality.
So I think that pledge has been, was a remarkable thing. But what China needs to do now is to step into the leadership void and really challenge the rest of the world. Put together the COVAX mechanism that will provide 20% of the necessary vaccines to all the countries in the world that have signed up for COVAX, and that's over 150. But the political will to do this has to come from leadership. So challenge the other the other advanced economies to step up and fund this mechanism. Put together the political will to make sure that at least 2 billion doses are available for the world by the end of 2021. That will be the challenge. And I think it's great that China stepped forward, and now it has a great position and an opportunity to lead and challenge the other countries to step forward also.
But if I could just have a footnote about that, their geopolitics has been making China-U.S. relations very interesting. When the research is going on about vaccine in China, the other side with the claim without evidence that somebody is stealing their information about latest vaccine research. So all of the things make things much more complicated, and I do not want to trouble a scientist to solve this problem, but just put it as a footnote. Dr. Jeremy Kim, as always, a pleasure talking to you, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Thank you for your work and that of your team.
Thank you.
To follow our discussion about vaccine, we are joined in Providence, Dr. Megan Rani, Director of the Brown Lifespan Center for Digital Health, and in Beijing, joining us, Professor Ding Sheng, Dean of the School of Pharmaceutical Sciences at Tsinghua University. What a pleasure to see both of you. It's always a great conversation when I talk to scientists and medical workers. Thank you. So what about the latest research regarding vaccine? Earlier we talked to IVI Director General suggesting at the end of the year a successful vaccine going to come out. Do you have similar belief, Professor Ding from China?
Yes, I think we're still very hopeful one or several vaccine molecules, actually, drugs, can come out actually towards the end of the year. Mm-hmm. Several of those actually are entering phase 3 studies.
Yes, indeed. And Dr. Rani, your thoughts?
I'm quite hopeful that by the end of 2020, we will have vaccines that have made it through phase trials and are ready for production. But of course, between here and there is a long time. There could be things that go wrong. But the sheer number of vaccines that are entering phase 3 trials gives me hope that at least one will make it through and show itself to be both safe and effective in preventing COVID-19.
What we are seeing, ladies and gentlemen, right now are teams from China, the UK, the US, Germany have been showing their potential products are safe, but there's still a long way to go. According to WHO records, 165 vaccine candidates have started some forms of trials, and 26 of them in clinical trials. 6 candidates have entered phase 3 trials. The real test lies ahead in the final phase trials, experts say. What do you think are some of the most important qualities the vaccine needs to have in order to be so-called successful, Dr. Rani?
So the first and biggest thing is that safety, which you already alluded to. So by the time a vaccine has made it through phase 1 and phase 2, it's been shown to potentially have some signal of efficacy and to be safe for someone who's totally healthy. But we need to give it to tens of thousands of humans across the country or across the globe to show that it's safe. The next thing that we have to show is that it's effective, that it actually prevents infection with COVID-19. We would cause huge problems if we gave people a vaccine that caused problems, but we'll also cause large problems if we give people a vaccine, make them think that they're protected, and then they're actually not protected. So that's where that phase 3 trial is really important in showing that the vaccine does work to prevent people from coming down with COVID-19. And time will tell if any of these meet both of those criteria.
Of course, a lot of criteria, yet we are coming into winter, which means the seasonal flu will be on the horizon once again. So some talk about the possibility of combining COVID-19 vaccine with the seasonal flu vaccine together. How does that work?
I think the first thing is really we need to have a safe and effective coronavirus vaccine before actually we're really considering combining such one vaccine with a flu vaccine. Certainly during the flu season, actually having a flu vaccine actually that can really reduce the flu outbreak. That actually can also help the overall healthcare system.
Are we going to see some even faster than expected way of doing things? After all, there are vulnerable groups, for example, the elderly, the medical workers, and also teachers. So how shall we see, on the one hand, the huge concern about the safety of these groups, and also the huge now population of the world that have already caught COVID-19, vis-a-vis the safety and also the long-term issue about a vaccine?
So the first thing that we absolutely can't compromise on is safety. We could compromise a little bit on efficacy. So for those very high-risk populations like healthcare workers or nursing home residents, maybe it's okay to give them a vaccine that's only 50% effective, that only prevents COVID-19 half the time. That might be better than nothing for those of us that are being exposed to it constantly. For the average person, though, and I'll say the average American because I'm American here, but for the average person or American, we would likely want a vaccine that's better than 50%. That's certainly better than the average flu vaccine, because we don't want people, again, to be going out and thinking they're immune when they're not. We, of course, after rolling the vaccine out, are going to continue to need to study it to make sure there's no long-term effects, to see how long it's effective for. But I agree that there are some ways in which we can hurry things up, and we already are hurrying things up compared to usual vaccine development. But we cannot take risks with vaccine safety.
As both of you indicated, it is very important, the trust and the safety. That's probably the most important things about a vaccine. Having said that, though, testing. Professor Ding, China now, the latest number I checked, under 100, including the suspected cases. So how shall we see the testing that the Chinese vaccine researchers and makers are doing around the world, and how to make sure it is with one standard?
Certainly, that's a tough situation given actually in China, there's actually not much a new infection. Certainly doing trials actually need to be actually complied with actually the international, the general guidelines. in terms of the trial design and also the enrollment.
Dr. Rani, in the United States, though, the number is huge. It's a place for testing, no problem, but how to do it and how to do it well, that's an issue.
As the other physician described, we have ample international and American rules around proper procedures for testing of vaccines. I expect that the tests for the vaccines that are currently in phase 3 will proceed no differently. They are all subject to institutional review board, ethics board regulations.
Another thing that we need to discuss is about, how should we understand the geopolitics involved in the overall process of researching, manufacturing, distribution, and the recognition as to which vaccine is effective or not? Dr. Rani, as a scientist, how do you think we can avoid unnecessary trouble and bring people the best and the most effective vaccine?
To me, at the end of the day, the science is what speaks. And if we run trials, if we present our scientific findings in peer-reviewed journals that have international reputations, if we make sure that we meet all of the ethical safeguards, hopefully the science will take care of itself. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of cross-national collaboration already on vaccine development, and most of it is occurring according to the highest possible standards, although there are some reports, such as out of Russia, that are quite concerning. So my hope here would be that we can overcome geopolitics with good ethical science.
Similar question, but in a different way, Professor Ding, to you. How do you see this very interesting phenomenon? On the one hand, there seems to be a little bit secretive from one team to another around the world, and then all of a sudden everybody wants to claim that they are the champion.
There's certainly aspect of the perceived competition from actually those front runners in vaccine development. But in our scientific and biopharma community, actually, different vaccine developers are not really in sort of racing against each other. Overall, people are actually publishing early data overall in a timely manner, and also providing some useful information to the general public. As a scientist, I don't really see much competition in such way. Even in vaccine development, negative data or failed development, actually, such information could also be very useful for making the next one more successful, more efficacious and safe.
And finally, it's also not just in the research lab, it's also on the stock market, isn't it? Any company that are claiming having a clue to a possible successful vaccine, their stock market price is going up, just like skyrocketing. So once again, this fanfare vis-a-vis real research, how do you think, both of you as scientists and researchers, that we should well keep this balance?
I certainly think that companies that develop vaccines that are safe and effective and quickly developed deserve to have their stocks go up. That will help hopefully encourage them to invest more resources into the development and the production of vaccines. But if they create fanfare without having the data to back it up, well, eventually their stock prices are going to fall. So I'm not too worried about seeing stock prices rise, because again, if the science doesn't back it up, if those vaccines are shown to not be effective, well, the market will take care of that as well.
Right. And Professor Ding?
There are actually a certain, perhaps called bad actors, using the market actually to benefit the company, perhaps in the short run. But as overall in the community, actually, there's actually very robustness in terms of developing the product, really actually being transparent about the data, with actually really highest standard in terms of regulatory process. I think actually overall we're pretty confident we can do this right.
We hope that will be the case. Thank you so much for both of you, Dr. Rani and Professor Ding. Really appreciate it. We are looking forward to the successful vaccine. If possible, at the end of the year, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. American culture dominates global pop culture, while Chinese culture is more challenging to master. Is this imbalance a feeling misunderstanding? We have asked an American scholar been researching about Chinese characters to tell his thoughts.
People will go back to the cooperative kind of atmosphere that we had before.
And this is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. To improve China-U.S. relations, one fundamental aspect that cannot be neglected is understanding each other's culture. However, this has proven challenging after 4 decades. While Chinese young people have spent decades embracing American pop culture, just like many around the world, which also drive them to study in the U.S., the U.S. still finds the unique system of Chinese language and philosophy hard to penetrate. David Moser is an American, but also a sinologist and linguist who came to China in the 1980s with an enthusiasm to learn Chinese characters and what's behind it. He said the lack of understanding of Chinese culture is still there in the U.S. today, and that could be problematic when the U.S. is trying to make up its decision as to how to approach China for the future. Take a listen. I'm joined by David Moser, Associate Professor at Capital Normal University. Now he's staying in Airbnb for months in the United States before he could make a trip back to China. David, good to see you after such a long time.
Good to see you too. I've missed you.
You're not only just regarding China as the most important home, but also doing enormous amount of research about Chinese calligraphy and Chinese characters. Tell me more about what is your understanding of the logic behind the Chinese characters?
Yeah, the Chinese characters are probably the most unique writing system in the world, aside from the Japanese who borrowed the kanji, the Hanzi. The Chinese characters are based upon a very different principle than the alphabet. And I think it's probably one of the most misunderstood scripts in the world, not only by foreigners, but also the Chinese themselves. Sometimes really don't understand how the script works, what its origins were, and how it functions in the modern, global language environment.
What are some of the myths, David?
It is not true that any ordinary Chinese can pick up the Lunyu, the Confucius Analects, and just read it just because it's written in Chinese characters. The language has changed a lot, and the modern language, the Putonghua, bears a very little resemblance to the old classical Chinese. The characters gives you a sense of what the topic might be and what the general gist of it is, but very few people, foreign or Chinese, can read classical Chinese easily. So that's one of the main myths, I think.
Does it matter what was it like before, in some of the Chinese classics, compared to the functioning of characters these days?
What the classical Chinese, which we call Wenyanwen, was always somewhat of an artificial language. It was not the language that anyone spoke in everyday life. It was a very special, terse kind of language with its own grammar and its own rules, and also a very, very terse, a very concise form of language. Classical Chinese is one of the most beautiful languages in the world, and it is capable of expressing very rich meaning within a very, very few characters. Its economy of meanings is astounding. And modern Chinese still has bits of that because of the characters. One character can be used in a multitude of different situations and can take on many different meanings depending on context. So what's so fascinating about Chinese is the things that you can do, the kinds of expression you can create with Chinese characters that an alphabet can never really accomplish.
We have seen the evolution of Chinese characters. There were complicated characters, and now it's much simplified characters. The evolution of it really also reflects China's relations with itself and also its relations with the rest of the world. And now we are also inviting, over the past few decades, alphabet into at least the pronunciation of these characters, and a way to let others, to have a bridge towards the Chinese characters. So how do you see this evolution parallel with China's involvement in the world?
Well, the challenge for China and moving forward with Chinese characters in the world, in the global situation, is that the characters are not well suited for use and adoption in the internet, in the digital world. In fact, in the 1980s, people were worried that perhaps Chinese characters and the Chinese language would sort of have to be sidelined or maybe eliminated in some cases in order to catch up and be part of the world internet, worldwide digital universe. But well, pinyin to the rescue. It turns out that China needs the alphabet and has developed pinyin and other romanization systems, because the problem with Chinese characters is they don't express the sound of the language like the alphabet is able to do. And the pinyin is now obviously used as one of the most common input methods. You may be using Chinese characters on your WeChat or on your computer, but lots of people, or most people, are using pinyin to enter those characters. So actually Chinese characters have a very bright future because they have a lot of advantages, and they're quite beautiful and they're aesthetic, and they're very quintessentially Chinese. And I think they're doing quite well on the internet now. And English is the most common language on the internet now, and Chinese is a close second.
China and United States changing so much in their own, also toward one another. David, when you were looking at the latest changes, sitting in your small room in an Airbnb because you have no home there in the United States, but your home is in China. So staying there for months, what's going through your mind?
Yeah, well, I'm very distressed by the recent events, obviously, because I'm someone who has devoted much of his life to trying to be a bridge between the two cultures. And when I first started that in the 80s and 90s, I could tell that China was going to grow and was going to be one of the most important world players on the stage, and that we Westerners needed to understand China, and at the same time, they need to understand us. And in the last, I would say in the late 1990s and the early 21st century, I was very optimistic that with advances in technology and the freedom to travel and the great interest on both sides, Chinese students, of course, love to go overseas and study in Western universities, and we had more and more students going to China. So I have to say, seeing the events of the last year, especially since COVID-19, it's quite distressing as an American, because you realize that America is sick right now, and it's not just from the disease; it's sick spiritually and politically, and it's hard to see your own country go down like this. But I'm still optimistic, because I think even now in this extreme crisis situation, I think there's even more of a need for the two cultures to work together to understand each other and to try to build understanding at the grassroots. Keep in mind, most of the conflict and the fighting going on now is really much from state to state level. You're talking about the top level, the level of government and policy and economics. The real heart of U.S.-China relationship is really the relationship between the people. And when I talk to my Chinese friends on WeChat and I keep in touch with them, that feeling that there's a bond between the two cultures is still very strong.
You came to China early 1980s, trying to learn Chinese culture. Must be exotic, I know. But at the same time, you probably got to know somewhat the real essence of China, because at that time the country was just opened to the rest of the world. You probably have noticed and found something about the Chinese that the others later would not be able to see so easily.
I very quickly realized that part of my goal was not just to learn the language and to learn the history and the policies, but I wanted to get to know the people. And I was very happy that I came to Beijing, because Beijing is a great place to learn and interact with Chinese people. Beijingers are so open and friendly and so curious and so open to dealing and getting to know foreigners. And I found it very easy to get to know them. There are many things I could say about my experience with Chinese people in the Hutong and the people that I met of all aspects of life, from the academics to the musicians to the artists to just the ordinary people. But one thing I will tell you is that, and that I think that Americans need to know, is that the Chinese people are, back then, were very curious and very much interested in trying to learn from the West. And they wanted to get stronger. You remember that Deng Xiaoping had the famous, statement of to Tao Guang Yang Hui, right? You bury your light and learn from other people. And I think that's the spirit of the Chinese people. There isn't much a desire among the people, or really the leadership, to work to dominate and rule the world. That's not something that's in Chinese history. Chinese could very well have done a lot more of hegemonic advancement on foreign countries, but it's strayed away from that. It stayed away from that sort of path because that was not, in its DNA, so to speak. And why it's so easy for foreigners to get along with them on the ground and to cooperate with them, because they're very helpful and they're very honest actually with you. So these are just some aspects that I've learned.
Besides your role as a student, as a PhD candidate, as a scholar, as a jazz musician, you're playing the boards, and also as a crosstalk, a Chinese-style comedy actor, you also have been leading academic tours of American students to China for a long time. And that, to many of them, was their first trip to this country. So from what you have seen, with their academic changes in China, how much do you think an experience in this country will be able to transform them to a certain extent about better understanding of who they are and what kind of future that they are likely to aspire to build?
The upshot of it is that the Chinese people and the Chinese government know much more about us than we know about them. So there is a difference. There's an asymmetry there. It's not equal. We have the internet. We're able to travel there. We're able to read books. We're able to learn Chinese. But there's still a huge gap between our amount of knowledge of China and the real China and the way that Chinese people are and the way they think, and the knowledge that Chinese people have of our culture. So my feeling right now is that these academic exchanges are even more important. Some of them are continuing apace. Some of them have been endangered seriously by COVID-19 and by the deteriorating U.S.-China relation. I hate to say that. I think we need to redress that imbalance, get more foreigners in China to learn the real China and to learn what China is all about, and then also to allow Chinese to also participate with foreigners either in China or outside of China.
Mm-hmm. If you look at some of the policymakers right now in the United States and their advisors, some of their advisors have been to China several times, and some of their advisors also claim themselves to be China expert. Really better understanding, quote unquote, leads to better policy, leads to better realities.
We tend to divide Chinese experts into two different camps. One is the dragon slayers and panda huggers, if you've heard that before.
Of course.
And Trump is someone who has surrounded himself with dragon slayers. And that means people who are very much antagonistic to China, or they fear China, or they see China as the next big world threat. But I'd like to remind people that in the United States, these sort of political seasons can be very passing, very transient. I believe strongly, and I hope, is a passing season that is going to be over in November, and we will be in a new era.
If you look at closely how the Cold War started and how the U.S. was, quote-unquote, doing the house cleaning with McCarthyism and other campaigns trying to clear out those who can speak out and those who try to still be the bridges. Many were cautious whether there will be a silencing of voices, such as voices of yours and your friends, and those who are trying to be either panda hugger or pragmatic in their approach toward China.
I am worried for the short term, and I have to tell you that I myself have actually experienced this sort of situation you're talking about. It's very difficult on social media to try to express these opinions about working together with China, not to decouple, the new term is decouple, and also to try and understand China and its background, its historical background, and also its current geopolitical situation, and try to understand things from the Chinese viewpoint. That doesn't mean that you approve or agree with it, but we do need to understand it, and we do need to have people who are explaining the rationale behind the Chinese policies and what sorts of historical forces and political forces have led to these sorts of decisions. I think that that's very important, but it's very difficult for people like me in social media and Twitter and other places to express these things, because you do get a pushback from the dragon slayers merely by trying to understand the Chinese mindset of the leadership and also the people themselves, that you're somehow agreeing or betraying your country or going over to the other side or something like that. So I think it's difficult. It's been difficult for me and some of my friends and colleagues, which you know, that are also trying to do the same thing. It's been difficult for them in this environment to defend China in certain ways, but also just to call for a deeper understanding of China. It's a going against the grain, against the tide in this particular environment. But it's important. We can only continue to do it, and I think that's the only way that we can avoid a real Cold War, which nobody wants.
David Moser, an American linguist and also sinologist. He is part of our series of pathfinders, the ones that are working very hard to create bridges between China and the United States. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight, or check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.